And we're back with Truth Unrestricted, the podcast that is creating and interpreting the language of the disinformation age. Before I get started, I just want to remind everyone that if anyone has any questions, comments, complaints, concerns about anything they hear on this podcast, you can send that email to truthunrestricted@gmail.com. When someone uses the phrase post-national agenda, what do you conjure in your mind? How close in meaning is this to the globalists? I found this video the other day, linked to me on Facebook by someone I knew. It's wildly inaccurate, and it's part of a series of videos being produced to very heavily and deliberately push for a single political outcome while pretending to advocate for something more balanced. And that sounds familiar. It's part of a larger network of people who push disinformation. The channel is called Blendr News. It was started by someone named Jonathan Harvey, although he isn't the person speaking in this particular video. There's a podcast feed that goes straight to YouTube, and they take smaller samples of their conversations from those YouTube videos to make shorter clips that they can also put into something called YouTube Shorts, and of course, TikTok. A post-nationalist agenda heavily implies the existence of a conspiracy to co-opt the governments of individual nations, to work not for the good of those individual nations, but instead for some other agenda that supersedes the goals of the people of those nations. This is completely compatible with the Illuminati conspiracy, that the elites, the ultra-rich and powerful, along with the leaders of nations, are all working together to subvert and corrupt the democratic processes globally so that they can choose who it is that becomes powerful in each nation rather than leaving the choice to the people of each of those nations. This conspiracy doesn't make very much sense, but it still appeals to many people. The idea that there's a shadow government that selects who gets to run each individual country sounds right at first. The US has participated in regime change in many nations, increasingly since the end of World War II. But that's not really what this conspiracy is supposing. If you thought that it meant that the leader of your particular nation were part of a cabal of steeple-fingered elites who decide everything, you would turn out to be wrong. It would so happen that if you thought that your leader is actually powerless and only a figurehead placed in front of your audience to make people believe that everything was fine. If you thought that your leader was just an innocent dupe who was powerless and being used to placate the masses into believing that they had self-determination, you would find out inevitably that you were wrong and that, in fact, your leader is elbow deep in the blood of innocents on a nightly basis because they have to drink the blood of children just to survive on a day-to-day basis. Whatever way you thought it was is inevitably not really the shape of it when you get to ask someone who has been looking into it to document the conspiracy. I mean, usually they'll admit that you have some part correct, but then we'll rapidly work to correct whichever part you have wrong and add in whichever part you haven't had a chance yet to see. You see, the game isn't about exposing some new and previously hidden part of objective reality. The game is to be the storyteller. The audience doesn't need you if they already know the story. So you have to constantly tell them why they need you by adding to the story. And the audience might not be interested unless you've already figured part of the story out. So you admit that some part of what the audience knows is true. Then follow that immediately with the part they still need you to decipher for them. The audience can never be smarter or more informed than the storyteller. The exact details are not consequential for the conspiracy storytellers. The content we're going to examine today is in a category that I call Illuminati Lite. It has all the hallmarks of full global conspiracy. Thinking along full global conspiracy thinking, along with many of the keywords and ideas that would be present in the full Illuminati version. But it's just a sample. It's just something that you slowly consume to allow you to build up a taste for the real thing. You get used to hearing the keywords and phrases used in intelligible sentences, and you can follow along with all the ideas in your mind, such that you think you're gathering in useful information. Then, later, when someone brings out the real deal, you recognize a lot more about what they're saying. If, in that more potent version, it's David Icke rambling on about shape-shifting lizard people, the tendency will be to either bite down harder on the belief, or to think that what Icke says is perhaps a little too far-fetched, but the gist of it, what he's saying, still makes a lot of sense. Newsflash, there are more than merely two choices for you if you ever find yourself in that position. This video comes across as a gish gallop. It's a lot of information that's reeled off in a very short succession to overwhelm the mind of the listener. Everything he says here has some small basis in fact, but most of the individual pieces are misrepresented, partly so that each one can be made to appear far more scary, but also to facilitate the idea that all of them are connected as part of a larger conspiracy narrative that he, as the storyteller and chief conspiracy pattern reader, can now decipher for you, the poor working pleb who can't take the time out of your busy life to find all the disparate threads and see how they should be properly woven together. And that's what he wants to be, the interpreter of the world for you. I haven't seen all of the videos from this channel, but I've watched a few, and I can tell you that they run the gamut. Full anti-vaccine. Everyone on the left is a cuck and a shill, most especially those who are prominent or in any way famous. Trump is a good guy, and wouldn't it be great if he were our guy? Musk is also good, and wouldn't it be great if Canada had its own Department of Governmental Efficiency? Taxes are too high and the Liberals spend them on stupid things. Crime is way too high and it has a lot to do with immigration. The Liberal Party of Canada is filled with traitors who are working to destroy Canada. The World Economic Forum is bad and probably where the globalist, post-nationalist plan is being coordinated. There's a surveillance state, just like in the book 1984. Climate change is a hoax. COVID was a hoax. Woke is bad. DEI is bad. 15-minute cities are bad and are an attempt to lock down the population. The Freedom Convoy had it right all along, and everyone lost their right to speak when it got shut down. The apocalypse will be here very, very soon unless the guy I like gets into power. Blah, blah, blah. These are all talking points taken directly from the US right-wing conspirosphere. They've been repackaged with metric volume labels and French-English titles on the box for import to the Canadian information market. With the exception of that Freedom Convoy thing, that's purely a Canadian event, but it so heavily resembles a lot of American events that preceded it that I don't feel bad including it here. The overall theme of the collection of videos from this channel is that you're getting screwed, and these are just the people who are going to tell you how it happened. I'm here to tell you how the magic trick works. Here's the thing. You are getting screwed. It's just not happening the way the people on this channel are describing. In human history, shortly after the first moment of human misfortune, the first grifter came along to tell the unfortunate who they should blame for their misfortune. Taking advantage of existing outrage is more than merely a cottage industry. It's now a thriving capitalist ecosystem online, and we need to call it out whenever we see it. So, full warning. This video is meant to throw out as much disinformation as it can in a very short time. We're going to listen to it only one time here, and then go through it after.
Donald Trump is not a threat to Canadian sovereignty, because Canadian sovereignty no longer exists. The Liberals, backed by their billion-dollar propaganda machine, are waging a psychological operation to convince Canadians that tariffs are an act of war and that enduring economic hardship is their patriotic duty to fight modern Hitler. Mark Carney claims it's 1938 in Canada, invoking the specter of World War II. Meanwhile, Chrystia Freeland openly suggests that Trump's tariffs justify forming a nuclear alliance with the UK and France against America. but Trump is not the real threat. The same people conditioning Canadians to equate economic pain with patriotism have spent a decade eroding national sovereignty and dismantling the economy in service of an international socialist order led by China. In 2015, just a month into his tenure, Justin Trudeau told the New York Times that, quote, Canada is becoming a new kind of state, claiming it had no core identity or mainstream culture. He called Canada the first post-national state. Post-nationalism seeks to dissolve borders, transferring power to global institutions like NATO, the UN, the WHO, and the World Economic Forum, effectively eliminating sovereign nations in favor of global governance. At Davos in 2016, Trudeau boasted that Canada was ready to, quote, take advantage of this transition. Fast forward 8 years, and this is the world we now inhabit. Ever since Trudeau's declaration, he has been implementing the UN's post-national Agenda 2030 under the guise of Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, the UN and WEF formalized a strategic partnership to accelerate Agenda 2030. Months later, COVID hysteria overtook the world, with nearly identical government responses, all following military legal frameworks designed for bioweapons attacks. COVID was less of a public health crisis and more of a coordinated military coup aimed to entrench the post-national agenda. It then emerged that Trudeau's government was allowing China's military bioweapons program to access viruses in research from Canada's top security biolab in Winnipeg. In any sane world, this would have been considered treason. Instead, when an investigation into the Winnipeg lab leak scandal began, Trudeau sued the Speaker of the House to block it, then called an unnecessary snap election in 2021, right in the middle of what we were told was the deadliest pandemic in a century. That same election saw Chinese interference to the benefit of the Liberal Party. China's control over Trudeau runs deep. Canada has become infamous as a money laundering hub for CCP-affiliated narco groups. Through the Vancouver model, tens of billions in fentanyl profits are washed through casinos, funding Liberal campaigns and compromising politicians. High-profile Chinese narcos have attended Liberal fundraisers, and Liberal insiders like Stephen Guilbeault sits on a Chinese Communist Party-controlled council, influencing Canadian policy directly from Beijing's playbook. The Liberal government's policies, mass migration, LGBTQ ideology, soft on crime laws, carbon taxes, censorship, and so on, are ripped straight from Agenda 2030, crafted by the UN and WEF. How can Canada claim to be a sovereign nation when its policies are dictated by global institutions and is compromised at every level from the streets to parliament by Chinese influence? For the past decade, Trudeau's regime has deliberately dismantled Canada. Now they're propping up Mark Carney, a man who openly supports using emergency powers in the face of Trump tariffs, just like Trudeau did when he overrode the Charter of Rights to crush the Freedom Convoy, a grassroots protest against the global coup designed as a health crisis. Not to mention, Carney is deeply intertwined with the exact same Chinese influence networks as Trudeau. I refuse to willingly endure financial or physical suffering for a regime that has sold Canada out to global elites, intent on replacing Western capitalism with a socialist world order led by China. This isn't about Canada versus America. It's about using Canada as a pawn to destabilize the US and prevent Trump from interrupting their power grab. I do not believe Trump is working in Canada's interest, nor do I see him as a savior. But I do believe he is working in America's interests, resisting the post-national agenda. This is why the left, which is driving this global takeover, despises him, because he represents a world order they seek to overthrow, one where nations prioritize their own interests over the dream of a one-world socialist government. They will happily see Canada crumble if it means weakening the last stronghold against global governance. Canada is being set up to become the Ukraine of North America. This is why Western leftists insist that Trump and Putin are your biggest threats, while they themselves construct a global totalitarian system. I am not saying Trump or Putin are heroes. Putin certainly isn't, and I remain skeptical of Trump. But the people telling you to fear them are the same ones eroding your culture through mass migration, DEI, and revisionist history. They are the same ones who tell you that fighting climate change is more important than feeding your children. They are the same ones who engineered bioweapons, used them to lock you in your homes, coerced you into experimental injections, and facilitated the largest upward wealth transfer in human history. They are the same ones who illegally spied on 33 million Canadians while simultaneously running psychological operations aiming to brainwash the public. They are the same ones siphoning billions in taxpayer money to enrich themselves while funding ideological pet projects abroad. Trump is not a threat to Canada's sovereignty because the Liberal Party made sure there is nothing left to threaten. With all of this said, this topic does deserve far more nuance, so over the coming weeks, I will provide an exhaustive documentary-style breakdown, naming names and referencing government documents to corroborate every single claim. Stay patient, as 10 years of geopolitical subversion takes time to unpack. However, follow my account and the Blendr report.
Okay, I'll wait for that with bated breath. Mike was not back there. Okay, from the top. Now that that's over, Donald Trump is definitely a threat to Canada by his own words. The Liberal Party of Canada only wishes it had $1 billion propaganda machine. This is just argument by exaggeration. Psychological operation is a phrase that's used as a narrative reality inversion tool and is a certain sign that who you're listening to isn't being sincere. The idea that tariffs aren't an act of war and that the real threat isn't Donald Trump, but instead the Liberal Party, is bifurcation. The present problem is being presented as having only two possible ways forward, and one is said to be the rightful or preferred path. In actual fact, it's possible that both Donald Trump and the Liberal Party are dangerous things we should keep our eyes on. I suppose it's also possible that neither is dangerous, but that seems like the least likely possibility by far. This video features a series of ideas that are mentioned very close together. He's not explicitly stating that they're all connected, and so now has an out if anyone, like me, ever accuses him of saying they're fully connected. But he also definitely wants you to think they're all related to each other. There's a conspiracy between China and the Liberal Party to fix elections, create COVID in a lab and release it on the world to crash the economy, use military force to gain control of every country all at once, and use something called Agenda 2030 to create something else he calls a post-national state. This use of juxtaposition to relate all of these things is what I call Schrodinger's meaning. He wants it to be both a conspiracy and not a conspiracy, depending on how he needs it to go when confronted about it. Also, he wants the audience to think all of the ideas he lists are connected to each other. He wants you, the audience, to imagine that it would be a pretty big coincidence if all of these things were just happenstance and that, therefore, there's a conspiracy. This is proof by association. To make the claim that all of these things happening shouldn't be treated as a coincidence is to say that these are not independent events. In other words, that there is something else connecting them all and causing them all to have happened this way. The audience is meant to imagine that the odds against all of these things happening in this exact way with this exact timing is really high. But before you can apply the mathematical rules that would justify using this kind of analysis, you must show that they are not independent, that they are in fact related. The thing that would make them all related is the existence of a conspiracy, except that a conspiracy is what he's attempting to prove exists. So he's assuming that a conspiracy exists so that he can claim all of these events aren't independent of each other. Then using their lack of independence, or in other words, their relatedness, to prove the existence of the conspiracy he previously assumed existed at the start. This is circular reasoning. If he was using this as merely an investigative tool to find a place to look for more evidence, he might be fine, but only if he actually found more evidence once he looked closer. That's where he runs into problems, and I suspect he knows it, which is why he doesn't give any more details other than what he gives here. So I'll throw in a few, and you might begin to see why these different sets of facts don't exactly add up to a cohesive conspiracy story. Blendr Guy suggests that Canada is attempting to be part of something. It has to do with Canada being a post-nationalist state and something about global elites. He's attempting to raise the fear that people outside of the democratic process in Canada have the real power in Canada, and that our government officials serve those interests instead of our own. Part of his problem with this story is that it makes more sense if he can point to someone who is that other entity, someone to be the antagonist of his little conspiracy play. He chose China. Interesting choice. Let's have a look. Canada's relationship with China is actually very strained at the moment. Several things have happened during Trudeau's time in office that have led to this. We detained a Huawei executive who also happened to be the daughter of a very important Chinese billionaire and threatened to deport her to American authorities. In apparent retaliation, China discovered that 2 Canadians who happened to be in China were doing espionage of an unspecified variety. Trade tensions between Canada and China have been slowly escalating for several years, with a series of tariffs that have been placed on various goods by both sides. This is partly why the addition of US tariffs is particularly inconvenient right now. It's also why there's never a good time to escalate trade tensions without good reason. Thanks, Trudeau. China has, as the Blendr Guy said, interfered in Canadian elections, but they haven't done so solely for the benefit of Trudeau or the Liberal Party. Conservative candidates have received money and other forms of support as well. It's almost like what China really wants is to help create a greater level of political division. I wonder if they've been successful. China created offices in Canadian cities with unregistered agents who have harassed Canadians of Chinese descent and threatened the family members of those Canadians who still reside in China. This led to Trudeau needing to formally rebuke the Chinese ambassador and ratchet tensions up between our two countries even further. Not sure why this would be necessary if Trudeau and Xi Jinping were happily holding hands and singing about their post-national utopia. The Blendr counter to this will be that all of those inconvenient facts are just part of that elaborate ruse that has required the willing and perfectly silent participation of China, the Liberal Party, and all the media outlets who report about it. It's the psychological operation that's meant to lead everyone to believe the opposite of what the Blendr Guy claims is happening. And therefore, according to Blendr and every other conspiracy storytelling grifter on the internet, they know the real truth. And they're here to lead the audience out of its stupor and toward the light. At some point in all that, the claim will be made that the lack of evidence for their claims is actually the way that you can be sure their claims are real and true. That it's an indication not that they're wrong, but rather that the deep state or the Illuminati or the ever-present them has put on so much effort just to confuse you. But if they were able to put so much effort to hide their tracks, why couldn't they put more effort into actually seizing power? It's a conspiracy that's both all-powerful so that it can hide any trace of its existence, but also incredibly weak and unable to ever get full control of the world. There were 2 scientists working in a biolab in Winnipeg who inappropriately sent information about their research to China in July of 2019. Interesting timing, right? The Blendr guy certainly wants you to think so. They were fired from their positions, and the managers of the lab were told that they needed to do better at maintaining all appropriate information protocols to keep such a thing from happening again. The real problem with using this for his coronavirus narrative is that these scientists were working on Ebola virus, completely unrelated. If one knows very little about viruses, one could imagine that research into Ebola virus could somehow assist Chinese scientists to create COVID. But this would rely upon you continuing to not know anything about viruses. I call this evidence aversion. It gets easier to hold the ideas you like in your mind if you know fewer of the actual details of how those things work. Indeed, it would have been easier to conjure the image that this information from the biolab in Winnipeg assisted in the creation of COVID if I hadn't just told you that their research was into Ebola virus. Maybe stop listening now so that you can bask in the glory of your own imagination rather than discover anything about the objective world. Also, with each passing year, as we collect more evidence, the genetic simulations suggest ever more strongly that COVID had a zoonotic origin, not created in a lab. While we still can't say definitively, and likely will never get to fully 100%, the fact that it has a stronger case for this rather than a weaker case means that we should probably pay attention to where the evidence is taking us. Just another thing that doesn't fit the Blendr narrative. It is hinted, but again, not explicitly stated, that there was coordination on the part of the disparate governments of the world to implement the same tactics and lockdown procedures worldwide during COVID. This is in direct contrast to the fact that we can see that they were not coordinated and nations came up with their own strategies for handling COVID with subsequent differences in results. Norway and Sweden are right next to each other and are practically cousins, yet they each chose far different responses during 2020, and the death data reflects that difference. Also worth noting, very few places had any military involvement in shutdown or lockdown procedures. We saw RCMP enforcement, but go ahead and tell the real military guys that the RCMP is military and hear the laughter from the next province over. Blendr guy wants to pretend that they were all the same because it goes along with his idea that there's some sort of group that's coordinating government agencies. Maybe even one that's giving directives or orders to those governments that they're accepting and following. What sort of organization might he be referring to? Too bad he didn't mention it in this video. I guess we're going to have to go do our own research into this and see where all those keyword searches lead us. Fentanyl does enter Canada from China. China is the biggest manufacturer of it and the chemicals that would be used to create it in a local laboratory. This is a major problem. However, in order to get to what Blendr guy is implying, you have to ignore the human equation. Allow me to explain. The claim that proceeds from drug sales is used to fund political campaigns has a lot of dots that need to be drawn in and linked up. It requires the audience to imagine that China isn't a group of human beings that have all the same sorts of differences that everyone else has, but rather that China is like an anthill where every Chinese person is linked to the central hive mind to coordinate their efforts to bring China to glory and all other nations to submission. The fact that China has organized criminals who smuggle drugs and guns and humans from China to other places is something that conspiracists like to co-opt into their individual narratives. In the case of the Blendr guy here, it doesn't work unless the drugs are coming to North America with the conscious blessing of and instruction from the same Chinese government that also wants to subvert Canada's democracy and create a post-nationalist state. That's why he calls the rich Chinese businessmen who have attended Liberal Party fundraisers Chinese narcos. In order to connect the sales of drugs to the clandestine political contributions, one must imagine them as being organized by the same entity. And to get to that answer, all Chinese people must be working together for the common good of China and to the exclusion of all other projects. By the way, the very act of imagining that citizens of China are fundamentally different in this way is racist. Sorry you had to hear about it this way. An idea that goes along with the racist hive mind idea is that everyone who has ever been in a room with Chinese people, most especially members of the CCP, is somehow also mind controlled by them and is doing their bidding rather than making their own decisions. I hate that what the Blendr guy said is forcing me to defend Stephen Guilbeault, yet do what I must. These conspiracy beliefs have to be countered somewhere, and I refuse to buy into them just because they please my inner biases. Won't you please join me? Canada isn't part of an international socialist order led by China. This is a conspiracy fantasy that's used as a wedge to persuade people to vote for the guy that Blendr prefers. Trudeau said some stupid things about Canada being a post-national state once upon a time. It pissed some people off. I can't read his mind, but it's very likely that Trudeau was angling to get some very specific attention on the world stage. He did a lot of things that were meant to raise Canada's profile and level of importance to other countries. He tried to get a seat on the UN Security Council. He did some very embarrassing things at the World Economic Forum. I'm not entirely sure what strategy he was working on, but it doesn't seem to have worked. Also, note the substitution of the word communist for socialist. It would be too on the nose and explicit to tell the audience that Canada is part of an international communist order led by China. So he goes with socialist there. I have no doubt that in other conversations, he regularly uses the two words as though they mean the same thing, because he wants the word socialist to be as strongly linked to communism as he possibly can. This is a common piece of right-wing rhetoric and completely predictable behavior. The direct lines of influence are also both deliberately vague and confusing. Is the influence on the Liberal Party from China or from the UN and World Economic Forum? One would have to imagine it was all three at the same time if one were to follow along with the overly complicated set of ideas spewed out by this video. If that were true, does anyone believe that China is in favor of mass migration, LGBTQ ideology, and is soft with their crime laws? Those aren't from China's playbook, and no one would believe that, which is why he has to say they're from the UN and WEF's playbook. Mentioning them immediately after, saying that China is influencing Canadian policy directly from Beijing's playbook, is only a little confusing, but it does play into that juxtaposition I mentioned earlier. Not directly saying these things are all related, but heavily implying them by simply mentioning them one after the other. Because I've done this dance with the right wing before, I already know the answer to my question. They would say, Beijing is making Canadian politicians do this to weaken Canada and make it easier to do something. Something that is yet to be learned or defined. claims that are never voiced become bigger and scarier in the mind of the audience. Once someone starts listening with intent, the storyteller never has to define that thing. They only need to continue saying scary things to increase the enormity of that undefined idea in the mind's eye. But we need to examine this particular piece of reality inversion just a little more closely. The political ideas of the CCP in relation to tight border controls to heavily limit migration, limiting or perhaps outright denying the existence of LGBTQ people, and fast-track judicial judgments with lengthy prison sentences are all perfectly in line with what Blendr Guy would like to see Canada implement. This isn't by accident. In his mind, the country that is secretly controlling everything has figured out the best way to be powerful, and therefore the game is now to reconfigure ourselves to resemble the political ideas of that country as closely as possible. Become like China in order to beat China. The most interesting part is that even he probably hasn't yet put that part of his own warped set of beliefs together in his own head. The way this group of content creators uses the word post-national is synonymous with the idea of a globalist elite that want to subvert democracy in every country and have each of the world's nations serve their needs. Dissolve the borders so that you're so much less safe. Or maybe that border is just an imaginary line that only exists to keep Trump from annexing Canada. Honestly, I can't keep track of the storyline being told here anymore. No one who uses the phrase globalist elites can ever come up with a comprehensive list of who they think are among these global elites. The names always shift depending on who is liked and disliked by the person leveling the claim at the time. This makes it no longer an objective fact of the world, but merely a narrative device, a way to easily educate the audience about who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist of the current story. Most everyone who uses the term would say that Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci are definitely in that group. Okay, but why aren't Trump and Musk in that group? Aren't they just as rich and manipulative as anyone else one might want to put on that list? Who is it that has most recently called for the removal of borders and expansion of territory? Also, if Canada is being set up as the Ukraine of North America to weaken and destabilize America, then wouldn't Trump be foolish to fall for such an obvious trap? If what Blendr Guy says is true, then engaging with Canada as an enemy rather than with the global elites is only going to get the US bogged down in a land war that they'll likely win, but at great cost. That doesn't sound like the stable genius I've heard so much about. But worse than all that is that among people who regularly refer to the globalists, the term is really meant to be an acceptable replacement for the Jews. It's part of a group of very old conspiracy ideas about the evil bankers who will foreclose at the drop of a hat, lend money out at usurious rates, and negotiate trade with trickster qualities that have them leaving with a pot of gold and you holding just an empty bag. Which brings me to the grossest part of Blendr Guy's rhetoric. Immigration. Fear of outsiders. Link that to economic fears. Link that again to the vilification of Agenda 2030, which is actually what it says it is. It's a set of ideas and goals describing how the richer nations of the world might assist in bringing the poorest nations of the world to a better standard of living. If you're proud when you help someone stuck on the side of the road in a snowstorm, or when you help out your neighbor by shoveling their walk when they're in camp, then why aren't you also proud of being part of a country that helps resolve conflicts and works to end the misery of poverty in faraway places. How is it that anyone could be proud of being a nation of helpful individuals, but say that they would be proud to not be a helpful nation? Would you pick and choose who to help out of a snowstorm based on the color of their skin, or on whether or not they looked like they were born here? If you would help someone on the side of the road regardless of their skin color, then why would you be against helping them in their own country? Why make them make the trip here just to get a better life? And why insult them with lies about immigration when they've done so? This particular content isn't meant to convince anyone of anything if they didn't already have a bias. It's meant to make people who have a bias feel better about having that particular bias. It's like a warm blanket and a cup of hot chocolate on a cold winter night. It's feel-good rhetoric for those who have been displaced by the current set of political and social norms. Its relationship to actual facts is tangential at best. If some portion of it doesn't need to be viewed through a keyhole in order to look true, then it's merely a happy accident. The people who create it are strong supporters of conservative politics. I'm not sure why they're creating content that's this far skewed from reality, but I can make a reasonable guess. I suspect they feel like they have to in order to get the political outcome they want. They don't mind that many of the individual ideas don't hold up to scrutiny because, in their minds, the entire picture is still useful. In the same way that a person could walk away from a David Icke lecture not convinced that shape-shifting lizard people exist, but still have the sense that there is some sort of global conspiracy, it's just less reptilian. These content creators will claim that everyone who disagrees with them is just doing so because of a highly successful and nearly seamless facade that the global elites have perpetrated on the Canadian population with the assistance of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. This goes hand in hand with casting themselves as the plucky, rebellious truth-tellers who will happily translate reality for you so that you can go on about your lives without needing to look too deeply into it yourselves. In actual reality, they've formed a belief that the existence of so many people who disagree with them is the result of propaganda, and therefore they needed their own propaganda to fight the propaganda monster they see pushing everyone to the opposite side. They're fighting fire with fire. They've shown up to a burning house equipped with a flamethrower. And as I try to point out that this isn't a useful tool, they, or one of their fans, will undoubtedly call me one of the sheeple who has willingly followed along with the mainstream narrative without questioning it. But then, the only way to make sense of the story they tell is to follow along like sheeple without questioning any of the claims they make. It only makes sense if you don't look too closely and also assume that there are no coincidences, ever, in the history of the world that has seen hundreds of empires rise and fall and currently has 8 billion people all living on it at the same time. Look, we all need to fight back against disinformation, and not just by highlighting other disinformation that suits our biases. There's a different item that I want to mention, both because it's currently topical, but also because it's related to the content being created by Blendr. There's been a meme going around claiming that Justin Trudeau is related to Mark Carney. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Blendr hasn't mentioned this, though they might yet. The meme goes like this. Okay. Margaret Trudeau, born Margaret Sinclair, is Justin Trudeau's mother. After her divorce from Pierre Trudeau, Margaret remarried a man named Fred Kemper and had 2 children named Kyle and Alicia. That's all completely true. In addition to that, Mark Carney's mother was born with the name Verley Kemper. Now, the meme claims that this is the sister of Fred Kemper, and that therefore everyone at the top of the Liberal Party is related. But there's a little problem, however. Verley Kemper is not the sister of Fred Kemper. They happen to have the same last name, but that's as far as the internet researcher who made this up looked, because they felt they didn't need to in order to justify the conspiracy conclusion they were going for. The internet is a neat and wonderful thing, and it contains multitudes. Here's another relevant piece. John Kemper is the father of Fred Kemper. John died in 2024 at the ripe old age of 103. Congratulations on making it decades past the average age, John. Here is his obituary, found online. It lists his children and grandchildren, including Kyle and Alicia, that Fred had with Margaret. What you won't see is a child named Verley Kemper. This is because Verley Kemper, Mark Carney's mother, is not a child of John Kemper. Verley Kemper is not the sister of Fred Kemper, nor are they cousins. John Kemper was born in Germany. Verley Kemper's family comes from Ireland. They're completely separate families. For everyone who claims that Trudeau and Carney are related and loves to brag that they do internet research really, really well, please work harder at this. The gist of the idea is not that Trudeau and Carney are related. It's about what it would mean if they were related. It's about forming the idea in your mind that they were born into an exclusive club that you have never and would never be invited to join. It's perfectly compatible with the tale of the Illuminati. Only it doesn't add that part in. They leave it there knowing that you'll get there yourself eventually. Illuminati Lite. Don't believe everything you read online, especially when it confirms your existing biases. It won't even be obvious why anyone would make something like this up, but they do it anyway. Some people just want to watch the world burn. As for Blendr, I think they should be ashamed. This is like a Canadian comedian doing all the jokes they just heard an American comedian do and hoping that the audience hasn't heard them yet. None of this is new. They make Canadians look like a bunch of chumps that can't come up with their own conspiracy fantasies. Work harder at this. Until next time.